On November 7, 1940, a major low-pressure system developed off the coast of Washington and moved inland through the Pacific Northwest. The newly completed Tacoma Narrows Bridge, just south of Seattle and rife with design flaws, proved to be no match for the lashing 40-mile-per-hour winds. Within hours, the third longest suspension bridge in the world at the time collapsed, one of the greatest engineering mistakes of all time. But the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was only the first casualty of the growing storm. At the same time, another disturbance to the south crossed over the Rocky Mountains and moved eastward over the Great Plains, fed by moist Gulf air that pushed the building system north toward the upper Great Lakes. The two systems soon merged to form a massive storm that covered thousands of square miles. Often called the Armistice Day storm, the strengthening gale slammed into the Great Lakes on November 11, 1940. Lake Michigan experienced the worst of it as lashing winds and blinding snow caught many unlucky mariners off guard. 3 huge freighters were sent to the bottom, dooming 66 sailors. In the blinding Maelstrom, those caught in the fury never had a chance. As a content creator, I spend a lot of time online researching, writing, and gathering materials to create videos like this one. Searching through archives, old newspapers, and obscure websites means a lot of tabs and a massive amount of information to parse through. I'm a team of 1, and I need every tool I can find to help me sort through all the chaos. That's why I use Opera as my web browser. Opera is faster, safer, and smarter than the browsers that I used to use. It offers a huge suite of features built for privacy, security, and everything you do online. Opera's AI feature Aria makes research easier. With Aria's highlight tool, you can select words or phrases and instantly get an overview of a topic, quick summaries of information, and even translations. This is especially great when I'm researching ships from other countries and come across articles in other languages. A huge part of my workflow involves searching through archives to find footage and images to use in my videos. I usually end up with dozens of tabs open at a time. With tab islands, Opera allows me to sort tabs into separate islands based on topics, and they can be easily collapsed, expanded, and rearranged. This makes it a lot easier to stay organized. And when I'm doing research or boring admin work, I almost always have a YouTube video playing in the background. With Opera's video pop-out, I can detach online videos into a floating window that I can resize and place anywhere on the screen. Plus, Opera's built-in VPN keeps my activities safe from unwanted trackers. Opera is also endlessly customizable with tons of unique wallpapers that you can install with just a couple of clicks. Download Opera today using the link below to up your online experience. It's free, loaded with features, and easy to use. Check it out today. Thank you to Opera for supporting the channel. And now, back to the Great Lakes. In the early morning hours of Monday, November 11, 1940, on the steamer Charles C. West, First Assistant Engineer John Schmidt was awoken by a fellow crew member. He was told to grab his camera. When he emerged on deck, Schmidt, an avid photographer, was delighted to see one of the most stunning sunrises he had ever witnessed. He said the water reflected 1,000 shades of red, orange, and purple. It was like being caught in the middle of a giant rainbow, and the sun just seemed to hang on the edge of the water like a painted backdrop. The air was unseasonably warm, and the lakes were calm. It was a lovely late-season day, and for the many steel freighters zigzagging across the lakes, it seemed that the 1940 season would end on a high note. By 1940, the Great Lakes were dominated by aging freighters. A flurry of building early in the century had long since passed, and the industry needs in the region were easily and efficiently met by a vast fleet of simple steel-hulled freighters. The Canadian-owned Anna C. Minch was one of these veteran freighters, and one of very few Lakers named after a woman. Built in 1903 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Cleveland, Ohio, the Minch, labeled hull number 415, came in at 4,285 gross registered tons and measured 380 feet, or just under 116 meters long, with a beam of 50 feet or 15 meters. She could carry 2,880 tons of cargo. Her long career on the lakes wasn't without incident. She suffered over a dozen collisions and groundings between 1907 and 1925. In December 1925, she became stranded in heavy fog on a late-season run at Fox Point on Lake Michigan. Tugs were deployed the following day to unlodge her. Once free, she began taking on water, but the flooding was quickly contained and the damage was repaired. In 1926, she was sold to the Western Navigation Company of Fort William, Ontario, and for the next 14 years, she enjoyed a relatively uneventful career. On Armistice Day 1940, there was no reason to believe that would change as the Anna-C Minch, now under the command of 55-year-old Captain Donald Kennedy, passed through the Straits of Mackinac into Lake Michigan with a load of grain from Fort William, bound for Chicago. Weather forecasters carefully watched the coming storm, but they weren't sure exactly where it was heading or what intensity the low-pressure system would bring. Meteorology at the time was still in its infancy, and it was difficult to predict a storm with any degree of accuracy. So while it was clear that something was coming, few could have anticipated the full fury of what was to come. Captains on the lakes paid little attention to the often flawed weather forecasts. Instead, they relied on their experience, instincts, and barometers. Even by the early afternoon of Monday, November 11th, the weather was still deceptively pleasant. On the Anna-C Minch, Captain Kennedy continued sailing south, completely unaware of what lay just over the horizon. Monday, November 11th, 1940 was a holiday. One not often remembered today in the United States, Armistice Day celebrated the end of World War I, the war to end all wars, or so it was thought. The unseasonable warmth that morning prompted hundreds of duck hunters to venture out on the inland lakes in the Mississippi and Fox Rivers to enjoy the holiday. Dressed for warm weather, the hunters were caught completely off guard when the winds changed in the early afternoon. At midday, it was 65 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but within just a few hours, the temperature plunged to just 10 degrees, and winds surged to over 50 miles per hour. Hunters who rushed to their encampments to take shelter were overtaken by waves churned up by the storm. Others froze to death in their small boats, or drowned as they struggled to make it to shore. At least 49 duck hunters were killed in the Armistice Day storm. But they were just the first casualties. For the many freighters plying the lakes, the dramatic shift in the weather caught them equally off guard. Cities at the southeastern end of Lake Michigan were caught off guard as a wall of wind blew in from the southeast, carrying an onslaught of rain and hail. Ceremonies held to honor Armistice Day were thrown into chaos, sending crowds racing for cover. The wave of destruction shattered windows, ripped signs from their posts, and sent utility poles toppling to the ground. Power failed throughout the region. Chicago and Gary, Indiana were in chaos as police and emergency responders were flooded with thousands of calls for help. As the brute force of the storm system passed over Chicago and moved to Lake Michigan, the water level dropped by almost 5 feet, briefly reversing the flow of the Calumet River. In Green Bay, paper mills and power plants that relied on the flow of the Fox River were forced to suspend operations. But further north, lake freighter captains doubted that there was any serious danger. Weather reports from the night before warned of high northeast winds, but these mild predictions were largely ignored. On the downbound Anna C. Minch, Captain Donald Kennedy was unconcerned. Running a little less than 4 hours ahead was the freighter SS William B. Davock. The Davock was yet another steel-hulled freighter built during the boom the region saw after the turn of the century. Labeled Yard Number 26, she was constructed in 1907 by the Great Lakes Engineering Works in St. Clair, Michigan, for the Vulcan Steamship Company, which operated the vessel until 1915, when she was sold to the Interlake Steamship Company. The Davock was on the larger side, especially when she was built, coming in at 420 feet or 128 meters in length, with a beam of 52 feet or just under 16 meters. As built, she came in at 4,468 gross registered tons, and could carry approximately 7,000 tons of iron ore, coal, grain, or stone. In the winter of 1922, the Davock underwent a major rebuild that significantly modernized the ship and slightly reduced her tonnage to 4,220 gross registered tons. It typically carried coal from Lake Erie to upper ports on Lake Superior and returned with loads of iron ore bound for steel mills on Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. For the most part, the Davock enjoyed an uneventful and productive career. By 1940, it was under the command of Captain Charles W. Allen and operated by a crew of 32. In the early afternoon, Captain Allen was heard on the radio telephone relaying his position and commenting that the weather was unseasonably mild. He had no way of knowing what was coming. In Green Bay near Baltimore, commonly known as Death's Door, the 416-foot or 126-meter long Sinaloa was one of the first freighters confronted by the storm. Just moments after dusk, she was overtaken by massive swells driven by fierce winds that seemed to come out of nowhere. The great freighter was rocked so violently that her steam lines ruptured, leaving them powerless to fight the storm. Unable to control their ship, her crew braced themselves as the Sinaloa was violently tossed around throughout the night. Luckily, she finally grounded on a reef off Sac Bay, near the tip of Garden Peninsula. Soon the aft crew sent a line to local fishermen on shore and a breacher's buoy was established. One by one, the crew of the stranded ship made their way ashore. Several had to pull themselves across the last few feet hand over hand. Fortunately, everyone on board made it safely to shore. The Sinaloa was thought to be a total loss, but she was soon refloated, repaired, and sold to the American Steamship Company in 1941. In Ludington, Michigan, the storm brought total chaos. At the Coast Guard station, Captain A.E. Christopherson was forced to order his watchman to abandon his post out of fear that the high winds would topple the station's watchtower. As the storm rendered the Coast Guard powerless to save anyone in need, 2 car ferries reached the city in a dire situation. The Pere Marquette No. 21 barely made port only after the ferry smashed into a series of old pilings. But the city of Flint, the flagship of the Pere Marquette fleet, was less lucky. The wind and heavy seas drove the ferry away from her entrance pier and sent the vessel broadside. She soon crashed into a breakwater on the North Beach. With 30-foot waves battering his ship, Captain Jin Vivang ordered the seacocks opened to flood the ship and allow her to settle into the sand. The quick action stabilized the stranded ship as rescuers and onlookers flooded the beach to watch the unfolding disaster and try and save those trapped on board. Huge waves churned up by the storm smashed into the great ship, sending columns of water surging into the air, illuminated by spotlights positioned on the wreck by onlookers. Her 48 crew members and 4 passengers were completely trapped. Rescuers had to wait for the storm to calm before they could rescue the survivors with a breacher's buoy and surf boats the next day. They were the lucky ones. Hundreds of sailors further out on Lake Michigan spent the evening fighting for their lives. By Monday evening, much of Lake Michigan was consumed by the storm. What started out as rain quickly shifted to hail and then to blinding snow. The whiteout was unrelenting, whipped up by winds that at times reached 80 miles per hour. Waves grew to 20 feet and would exceed 30 as the storm intensified. Even the largest and best equipped lake freighters were thrown into a struggle for survival. Earlier in the day, as winds began to grow, they originated from the northeast, prompting many freighters to hug Lake Michigan's protected eastern shore. But as the storm blew in, the winds shifted dramatically, leaving the great freighters completely exposed to the worst that the gale could muster. The downbound SS Minch and William B. Davock soon found themselves in the worst possible position to ride out the storm. Neither ship had the power to keep in control as they lifted and fell through the violent waves. Their engineers struggled to keep their propellers from overspinning as they repeatedly lifted out of the water. Not far away, the Canadian freighter SS Novadoc was also fighting her way through the storm. Sailing north from Chicago bound for Port Alfred, Quebec, Captain Stipe hugged the eastern shore, leaving the small ship vulnerable when the wind suddenly shifted. Both the tanker New Haven Saucony and the 605-foot freighter Thomas F. Cole shifted course. Steering their ships into the wind, they sailed for the open lake. This would keep their bows heading into the punishing waves, protecting them from capsizing or swamping. Captain Stipe attempted to do the same with the Novadoc. But as the 2 larger ships disappeared into the blizzard, his ship failed to generate the power needed to change course. Built in 1928 by Swan Hunter and Wingham Richardson Limited in England, the 253-foot or 77-meter-long ship should have been capable of making the turn. Designed for versatility, the Novadoc was capable of generating more power than many of the underpowered lake freighters. But no matter how many times Captain Stipe begged his engineer for more power, his ship never seemed able to muscle through the storm. In the chaos, Captain Stipe briefly sighted another Canadian freighter, the SS Minch, fighting her own battle through the storm. Seeing the larger freighters struggle for control was no doubt discouraging, as it increasingly felt like the Novadoc was fighting a losing battle. Captain Stipe later confided that he suspected that either his firemen were too seasick to adequately feed the boilers, or they were maybe cursed with poor quality coal. In either case, the small ship was never able to generate the power needed. Instead, the Novadoc became hopelessly trapped in the trough between waves, violently rocking side to side as the storm pushed them relentlessly to shore. It was clear to Captain Stipe that his ship was moving dangerously close to the breakers just south of Ludington. He advised his crew to remain at their stations, and they were strictly forbidden from going out on deck. At the Sable Point Lighthouse, Keeper William Crewell spotted the lights of the Novadoc piercing through the blizzard. It was clear to Crewell from how the ship was tossed wildly from wave to wave that they were in serious danger. He immediately notified the Ludington Coast Guard station, while Assistant Keeper Henry Vavrina raced to the beach with a flashlight to signal to the endangered ship that they were ready to offer assistance. But as Vavrina stood shivering on the icy beach, repeatedly signaling to the ship, he received no reply. But Keeper Crewell knew the area well, and the first light of dawn revealed that the Novadoc beached exactly where he had predicted, approximately 150 yards offshore, 2 miles north of Little Point Sable. The grounding shattered the small ship, severing her in half. Onlookers wondered if anyone on board even survived the brutal night, but to their relief, movement was sighted in the ship's pilot house. At least some of the crew survived. But it would be over 36 hours before anyone braved the angry might of Lake Michigan to save them from the shattered freighter. The night was less forgiving to others on Lake Michigan. Captain Stipe of the Novadoc was likely the last person to see the Annecy Minch above water. Captain Donald Kennedy fought through the night to keep his ship on course. But as the storm mounted and the waves grew, he likely found it increasingly impossible to maintain his heading. For the aging freighter that survived over a dozen groundings and collisions throughout her nearly 40-year career, the brutality of the storm proved to be too much. At some point in the night, her hull split in two. From that moment on, her 24 crew members had only moments to react before they were thrown into the icy waters of Lake Michigan. With the ferocity of the storm, they had no hope of survival. All 24 people on board were lost. The William B. Davock fought a similarly futile battle. For a time, it probably seemed to Captain Charles W. Allen that his mighty freighter would survive the storm. But sometime in the night, a sudden jolt ricocheted through his ship. Suddenly, the rudder stopped responding to the wheel, and the ship plowed recklessly to the side, completely out of control as her power faded away. The ship slipped into a trough where she was no match for the 30-foot swells. The Davock soon rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. She took all 32 of her crew down with her. The sunken hull of the William B. Davock was discovered in May 1974, not far from the wreck of the Annecy Minch. Forever linked by the great storm that doomed them both, it was thought that the two freighters might have collided with one another in the whiteout. But upon further examination, it was soon clear that the two ships were both simply overwhelmed by the storm. The Minch broke in two, and it was found that the Davock's rudder was jammed hard to port. At some point that night, the punishing lifts and drops into the sea broke her rudder and crashed it into her propeller. From that moment on, the Davock was doomed. Of the three ships lost that night, the Novadoc was undoubtedly the luckiest, but her crew went through hell. While the wreck was known from the very first light on Tuesday morning, the local Coast Guard crews were completely overwhelmed by the storm and unable to mount any rescue. As the powerless Novadoc was battered by punishing waves and icy winds, Captain Stein and his crew waited 36 hours for rescue. In the panic immediately after the ship grounded, cook Joe Shane and his assistant Philip Flavin attempted to leave the stern and dash to the pilot house, where they thought they would be safer. But the ship's icy decks proved impossible to cross. Both men quickly lost their footing. They clung for a time to the railing before the unrelenting surf blasted over the ship and swept them away. The rest of the men, having watched their crewmates disappear into the waves, remained in either the pilot house or the galley. They huddled together and burned furniture for warmth. Finally, Captain Clyde Kloss of the fishing tug Three Brothers had enough of waiting for the Coast Guard. He and his two crew members, Gustav Fisher and Joe Fountain, set out to rescue the stranded men themselves. They pulled alongside the stricken ship and pulled the 17 survivors to safety. Amazingly, only 2 men were lost in the tragedy. The wreck of the Novadoc proved unsalvageable, and she remained on the beach until the unrelenting surf tore her apart. Monday, November 11th, 1940 promised to be a beautiful day, but it ended with unprecedented death and destruction, with hundreds fighting for their lives. At least 66 sailors died on Lake Michigan in the Armistice Day Blizzard. In addition to the 3 lost freighters, 2 fishing tugs, the Richard H. and the Indian, both vanished in the storm with their entire crew. It's considered one of the deadliest and most destructive storms to ever hit the Great Lakes. Like all too many Great Lakes stories, the tales of the Anna C. Minch and the William B. Davock are tragically incomplete. No one knows exactly what happened in their final moments. But one thing is certain: when their crews woke up that morning and witnessed nature's majesty, they never could have imagined that their lives would soon be snuffed out by nature's fury. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, support the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you again to Opera for sponsoring this video. Download it today using the link below to support the channel and up your browsing experience. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Till the next one, be nice to people.